This is the largest public sector conference, diversity, equity, inclusion conference in the Northwest. At this particular time, it is indeed my privilege to introduce to you one of my colleagues on the planning committee. I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Aidan Grinnell.
Thank you, Emmett. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aidan Grinnell, and I work for Home Forward, formerly the Housing Authority of Portland. I am honored to be serving on the Northwest Public Employees Diversity Conference Planning Committee, and have also had the great pleasure of serving on the selection committee for the 2015 Robert Phillips Regional Diversity Award. This award is named in recognition of Robert Phillips, founder of the Northwest Public Employees Diversity Conference and former Affirmative Action Officer for Multnomah County. The award honors employees, work groups, teams, or departments that demonstrate a respect for and a commitment to diversity that goes beyond their day-to-day job performance. This year, the selection committee received outstanding nominations, and many of those were groups or teams. I want to take a moment to recognize those that were nominated. Robert Phillips has worked in the area of equal employment opportunity for over 25 years and has a long history of involvement in the civil rights field. As director of Multnomah County's Affirmative Action Office, Robert was responsible for development of policy initiatives, plans, and programs that promoted respectful work environments for diverse employees and assisted the organization in meeting its equal employment opportunity and affirmative action obligations. Robert Phillips also served as a commissioner for the Port of Portland's Civil Service Commission, where he served for over 10 years. In addition, Robert Phillips was a recipient of the 2009 Arthur Fleming Award by the Multnomah County County Managers of Color, and Oregon Assembly for Black Affairs Political Development Award, as well as the Northwest Conference of Black Elected Officials Leadership Award. The Multnomah County Board of Commissioners proclaimed February 28, 2012 as the Robert Phillips Appreciation Day in Multnomah County. This award that we're presenting today is the Robert Phillips Regional Diversity Award, and it was created to honor Robert Phillips and his many contributions to the field of equity for all. It is with great pleasure for me to introduce to you Mr. Robert Phillips.
Thank you very much for the acknowledgement. I'm going to take a few minutes for founder's privilege. We're living in tough times, but each of us need to recognize tough times never last, but tough people do. And as public employees who serve, you are tough people. Give yourself another hand. The fight goes on. I want to just acknowledge the conference focus over the years, the conference focus today. One, accountable governance. We have to have accountability on how we serve and direct programs towards our public needs. Evidence-based outcomes for results. We have to have programs that work, that are evidence and outcome-based, producing the desired results, both in terms of compliance with public policy, but also making sure that those in need in our community have a voice in what we do and be heard. Lastly, I want to point out the core values around the work that this conference is all about: diversity, inclusion, equity. All of those things are important to how we deliver and serve our public. They're what the public expect, and it's what we need to be all about. As we see our world today, we see massive migration, people moving out of countries into new countries all over the world. And I want to tell you, it breaks my heart every time I look and see people crowded in boats, trying to just find a new home, new freedoms, new opportunities, many drowning because they're just overcrowded in those boats. And as I said, it just breaks my heart, but it's the new reality of our world, and it's the new reality on why this work is important. We have to be leaders in recognizing our world no longer have borders. We're a borderless world, and people are moving around and into areas that have not known much of diverse representation. I want to thank you each for being part of the solution, not part of the problem by denying and not understanding what's happening in our world. So again, I say thank each and every one of you for being here, for keeping this conference alive, and for recognizing why this conference is important to each of our governments and to each of us as we attempt to navigate this new world. Thank you. I am very proud of the group that we will be recognizing with this award today. They represent the first team-based group to receive this recognition. It's something that we have always desired to see, something today we want to encourage other work teams to figure out how to work together to become a team around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today, our selectees are great models of that. We've selected for this award the Procurement Services Division of the Office of Management and Finance, Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services of the City of Portland. And I'm kind of pleased about that because one time I was director of affirmative action for both Multnomah County and the City of Portland, and I worked very closely with the Office of Management and Finance. A great team of people, committed team of people, and it's just wonderful to see this unit receive this recognition today. They're responsible for the procurement process and ensuring that the process is fair, efficient, effective, and accountable. As a nationally recognized agency, the division strives for forward-thinking leadership, expertise, and professionalism. Through the years, the City of Portland Procurement Services have been a leader in diversity and equity initiatives. Working as a team, division staff and leadership have actually listened to the contracting and vending communities, assimilating these conversations into possibilities. That's one of the words I love, possibilities. I'm always trying to be a possibility thinker day in, day out. Identifying new ideas, transform those ideas into reality, and have found better ways to achieve goals and garner success. Some of these new and improved programs include professional and technical and expertise services aimed at minority business and emerging small business initiatives, including direct contracting, minority evaluator programs, update to the pre-qualification programs, prime contractor development programs, workforce training and hiring. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are not concepts new to the city. They are embedded in all of the work undertaken by the Procurement Services Division. Seen in the program information and training provided to both external and internal customers, provided as part of city programs that serve the contracting community and in partnering with minority, women, and emerging small businesses. Here today, and as she come up, if members of that team is here, I also would like you to stand as your Chief Procurement Officer receives the award, and that person is Christine Moody, City of Portland, Chief Procurement Officer.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Diversity Committee, I present you with this award in recognition of all of your great work in diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Thank you. So thank you, Robert. As Robert did say, this is a huge honor being the first officer division to receive this award. All past recipients have been individuals. And I am proud of the staff that works in procurement services. They are all professionals that have been part of making sure that when the city spends money, it provides the best value to the city by being inclusive of social objectives. In particular, our leadership team all assist in shaping minority and women contracting policy, including Barb Gibson, who's my right-hand man. While we are all moving forward to the next thing, Barb remembers to celebrate our accomplishments, and I really appreciate her being there to remind us of this work. In addition, nothing could be accomplished without the partnerships of our city bureau customers, the support of Chief Administrative Officer Fred Miller, Chief Financial Officer Ken Rust, City Council, and all of the city bureau directors is impressive. And this truly makes this work rewarding, as well as we are all working on a common goal. What new opportunities are around the corner? Let's work together and find out. Thank you.
Come on, let's give them one more round of applause. They've earned it. They have earned it. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you Patty Unfred, who's the Program Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Metro, for a special recognition. If Patty would make her way to them.
Thank you, Emmett. I'm here with members of Metro's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team. There's a couple more, I think, making their way up. We're here to present a special award to our other teammate, colleague, and friend, Bill Tolbert. Periodically, we're reminded how important it is to take time to appreciate and thank people who've made a difference in our lives, who make a difference in their place of work and in their community. Today, it's our honor to recognize and thank someone who has not only been instrumental in the planning for this conference, but has changed the way that at least 2 large organizations address diversity, equity, and interact with their community. Bill Tolbert has been Metro's Diversity Program Manager since 2012. Before that, he was in charge of recruiting at New Seasons, served as the Deputy Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the state of Oregon, and was a steward for United Airlines for many years, so he has traveled the world. He has served on the board of the Urban League of Portland, along with many other volunteer activities. And now I'd like to introduce Cassie Salinas.
Now that's just his resume. But what has he really done? Bill likes to say he plants the seeds for change. The seeds he has planted are sprouting all over the region. Bill's commitment, inclusive leadership style, and infectious sense of humor, with the occasional dance party on a Friday afternoon, which makes it very fun to work with him. We have created a supportive work environment where Metro staff and many others in the community feel comfortable learning more about diversity and growing. The pictures behind you depict some of the many activities that Bill has introduced that has really truly changed Metro's culture. Metro's first ever Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Month in January of this year provided multiple activities for staff to engage in learning opportunities and also people to participate in completing their very own I Am From poem. People were able to share their personal stories, and more than 100 staff were recognized with the DEI Difference Maker Award. He provided cultural celebrations from Hispanic Heritage Month to Asian Islander Pacific Month, and Metro's presence in the annual Pride Parade have grown ever since Bill came on board. Bill has crafted a series of learning events that have brought staff to learning about stereotypes to our own current work exploring unconscious bias. After the events in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, Bill invited staff to participate in a facilitated discussion and share their reactions to the tragedy, as well as their own experience in a very safe place. Bill's quiet superpower is his ability to inspire and bring out the best in each of us. We've included a few quotes behind us on the slides from Metro staff and some of our communities from across the region about all the impacts that he has had on them.
Robert Phillips mentioned tough times. This spring, Bill was diagnosed with cancer. Through radiation and chemo, Bill's passion for his work has remained, and he constantly emails our team with ideas, articles, and information. He continues to work part-time during his treatment, and it's moments like these that remind us of what is important in life, and to take the opportunity to share inspiration and gratitude. When I asked Bill if he was okay with being recognized today, in typical fashion, he didn't want to talk and he didn't want the focus to be on him, but on the collective impact of all of our work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. He wants us all to realize our opportunity to make life better for our coworkers and the communities that we serve. So to Bill, I know he's somewhere right here, we want to say thank you. You continue to teach us and everyone at Metro every day, and you're making a lasting impact to this community. On behalf of Bill, we want to say to all of you, keep planting the seeds of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Use this moment to recognize and celebrate that we are making progress, and this work matters. I'd like to ask Bill to stand and receive the thanks of a grateful community for his passion, his heart, and his ongoing service. Bill?
I think it's really great that we took time out to acknowledge Bill Tolbert. He is exactly who they say he is. Not who he was, but who he is. And I'd like to take just a little bit of license today to say thank you to Bill, because he's been a tremendous example in his work. I want Bill to know today that I have always respected him. And I want him to know that when he's talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion with that soft voice of his, I want him to know that I've always listened. Thank you, Bill. It is indeed my privilege and my honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker for the afternoon. Her name is Walidah Imarisha. She is an author, an educator, public scholar, and poet. She is the author of the collection of poetry Scars, Stars, and the upcoming nonfiction book, Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 stories of crime, prison, and redemption. She is also one of the co-editors of the anthology Octavia's Blood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. She has taught in Portland State University's Black Studies Department, Oregon State University's Women's Gender Sexuality Studies Department, and Southern New Hampshire's English Department. Would you put your hands together and give a rousing welcome to this afternoon's keynote speaker, Walidah Imarisha. So you need me to turn that on too, right?
Is it on? Oh, yes it is. Great. Yes. I'm going to come on out front, hang out with y'all. So I'm very honored to, at first I feel like I want to be like, you should get a car, you get a car. I was like, hold it in, hold it in. I did not hold it in. But in addition to that, I'm very honored to be asked to be the keynote speaker. I'm incredibly appreciative to the hard work of the organizing committee, thankful to the co-chairs, especially my fellow poet. You know, when he said the thing about Bill, I was like, that's a poet right there, right? Where it just goes straight to the heart. So I'm very honored to be here. And I'm excited to talk about some of the themes of the conference. And I think it's been interesting to hear different themes. It's been interesting to read the workshop titles and descriptions that folks have been attending, to see the words that we often talk about a lot today: diversity, inclusion, equity. And I think one of the things about these words is that they are very large and oftentimes not defined, right? So that oftentimes we have very different meanings of what those words mean, and I think more importantly, probably, very different meanings of how that operates on the ground. And so I think, you know, diversity is kind of the most used term, especially here in Portland. And I think that, you know, at its best, it's talking about raising up the experiences of those folks who have been marginalized institutionally in the society and fundamentally shifting those institutions to create justice for all of us. I think that, unfortunately, at its worst, it can often just focus on who's in the room, right? And making sure that we have one of each, right? Like collecting baseball cards. You want to have one of each. You don't need 2 Jose Cansecos. You just need one, right? And if you get them all, you win. I think Simon Tam's workshop's title was partially Stop Tokenizing Me, right? That is sort of the epitome of how that can operate. And so I think that's partially why I find it useful to talk about justice rather than just talking about diversity, because diversity, again, at its worst, is just getting folks in the room. But I think justice talks about what is the shape of that room? How does power function in that room? Who controls that room? Who owns that room? Whose input is valued in that room? And finally, how can we transform that room entirely? So I think that, you know, again, at its worst, diversity has become this sort of blanket term for anything not mainstream, right? And I've heard it used to mean often as a code word for race, but I've actually been in meetings where I had no idea what folks were talking about when they were saying diversity. And in fact, at some point, I realized in 2 different meetings, one time it was about bicyclists, and one time it was about folks with piercings and different colored hair. And these were all under the rubric of diversity. So I think that the concept of the word diversity in that context makes this concept a safe and clean term that can be used so that folks can feel good about the conversations they're having without actually looking at the ways that structural inequalities operate. And I think that it's incredibly important that in that context, diversity covers up the horror of oppression the historic and current institutional violence that keep the systems that shape all of our lives functioning, right? If we want to talk about real justice, we have to talk about that violence. We have to talk about the violence of poverty, right? We have to talk about the violence of the criminal legal system. We have to talk about the violence of no work, of unemployment, right? And we have to talk about those everyday violences that normalize the institutional oppression that, again, keeps the systems that shape our lives functioning. So I believe that what is useful about the term justice at its best is that justice allows us to talk about institutional oppression and institutional change, rather than just individual actions. And because the theme of this conference is equity at work, right? There's a huge question of justice in that, right? Because it's not just about who's doing the job, right? But it's about what job are they doing? What work will folks do once they get into that room? What is the impact of that work on oppressed communities? Who's deciding that work? What is the long-term vision of that work? And who gets to define that long-term vision? And I think that we have to talk about this in ways that are not abstractions, but recognize that this is life and death reality for people in our communities every single day, right? That this is not a theoretical discussion, which it's easy to think about in this room, especially me with the spotlight in my face, right? But oppression is literally killing people constantly, every second that we're engaging with. And right here, people in our communities. And part of justice is talking about that, talking about it explicitly and specifically, right? We need to have conversations that make people uncomfortable, right? Because that's the only way that we get to talk about the ways that these institutions have rooted themselves deeply in our society. I think that if people are having comfortable conversations about justice, they're probably not having conversations about justice, right? And I think that when we have those conversations that are uncomfortable, and when folks get uncomfortable, it allows those folks to think about their own privilege in not having to think about those issues every single day in relationship to their own survival in their community, as marginalized and directly affected folks have to. So in that light, we have to talk about things like race explicitly, right? And I think that it's very clear in this society, we don't want to do that. We don't want to talk about race, right? We would love to think that we are post-race as a society. This is one of the many racial myths that we tell ourselves, that we would prefer, if we have to talk about power and inequality, to talk about class, right? That feels safer. I think that if we're really talking about class and the ways that wealth functions in society, we are not actually safer. But while we absolutely have to talk about class, and we absolutely have to talk about the intersections of identities, to talk about the ways that race and class and gender and sexual identity and national origin and ableism all intersect with one another and center those folks who are dealing with multiple oppressions, we also have to talk about race specifically and explicitly. And one of the reasons we have to talk about race is these statistics that I'm going to show you from the State of Black Oregon 2015 report put out by the Urban League of Portland. I encourage everyone to download it. If you haven't, it's an incredible document with immensely disturbing numbers detailing the wide gap of racial disparities in Oregon. But this statistic is horrifically and brutally important because it highlights why we have to talk about race. So the statistic says that Black babies are 45% more likely to be born with low birth weight than white babies. They're 33% more likely to die as infants than white babies. And it says that disparities between Black and white birth rates exist regardless of the class of the mother. So whether you are a working class Black woman or whether you're a wealthy Black woman, your babies are more likely to die than white babies. This is why we have to talk about race, because there is the reality of being a person of color in this country and dealing with racism every day that lives in people's bodies and causes them immense pain and trauma. And in fact, the DSM-5 has recategorized racial trauma and racism in the same context as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And this is, to be clear, not I suffered a horrific, singular, giant, violent event around my race. This is, I got up in the morning, I brushed my teeth, I went to work, I bought my lunch, I went to a movie, I came home, I watched some TV, I went to bed. And that is racial trauma. And that is in the same category as post-traumatic stress disorder, because I did all of that while being a person of color in a racist society, right? And that reality, that post-traumatic stress of living with racism every day is living in people's bodies and killing them and killing the next generation as well. And we have to realize that this is not something that came out of nowhere, right? We have to realize this is rooted in history. I'm a historian, some say history nerd, whichever, it's cool. So I strongly believe we can't understand our current reality without understanding history, right? Without understanding what folk singer Utah Phillips called having the long memory, right? Because oftentimes we say, okay, well, let's look at the origins of these problems. Let's look back 10, 15, 20 years, right? That's as far back as we're going. We can't possibly hope to understand the current situation, the lived reality. And we end up with stories like this one that came out this week, that McGraw-Hill, who is a major textbook publisher, putting out schools that, we probably all engage with McGraw-Hill textbooks, put out a history book for 9th graders that called enslaved black folks workers, right? The exact quote says, "The Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations," right? This is what happens when this historic context is purposely erased, right? This idea of reducing this horrific, brutal, violent system of slavery into this benign, and comfortable racial myth that we can tell ourselves that, oh, black folks came here just like everyone else to work, right? And not actually having to talk about the foundations of this country in slavery or talk about the repercussions that are continuing today, right? This hides the systems of oppression and the way they were built and how they function. So I think it's incredibly important to recognize, these structures didn't just spring forth like, Athena fully shaped from Zeus's head, right? I said I was a history nerd. I said that. You heard that. They were constructed over generations for hundreds of years, right? And Oregon actually becomes, in my opinion, a very useful case study because Oregon was comfortable enough to write down its constructions of these racial institutions literally in black and white, right? So Oregon's conception is as a white homeland. The idea behind Oregon as a state is as a racist white utopia. The call actually went out to folks, come to Oregon and build the kind of white utopia, the kind of white society that you dream of without the problems of the day, which were coded language during that time for people of color, right? And we can see over and over again the ways that this idea of a white homeland has been enacted through law, through policy, through practice in Oregon. So probably one of the most horrific and important pieces happened in 1844, when Oregon was still a territory, and Oregon outlawed slavery, but it also included the first racial exclusionary law that banned black folks from living in Oregon. And it included the lash law that said that black people would be publicly whipped every 6 months until we left Oregon. Right? So this is the foundation of this state, right? And Oregon was birthed out of this conception of being both anti-slavery and anti-black. And I think a lot of people, they're like, mind blown, how can you be anti-slavery and anti-black, right? Because we tell these racial myths about slavery. But for many white Americans, slavery was an economic issue. So they were against slavery because it messed with their money, but they were also anti-black. That is the nexus where Oregon was built. And it it resulted in Oregon in 1859 being the only state admitted to the Union with a racial exclusionary clause. This racial exclusionary clause banned black folks from living in Oregon, from making contracts, from holding real estate. So black people were, in essence, the first undocumented folks in Oregon. To be black and to be in Oregon was to engage in a criminal act. All you had to do was be black and be in Oregon, right? I think the other piece that's incredibly important and relevant for us, and especially for folks who are working in the public sector, is that this language was in the Constitution until 2001, right? So until 2001, Oregon's Constitution included the racial exclusionary clause. And it was not an oversight, because the black community had gone again and again and said, please remove this language. Please tell us this is not the kind of place that you want to live, right? And again, it was actually reinforced, this is actually exactly the kind of place we want to live. And anybody who was here in 2001 remembers, it was a fight to get that language removed from the Constitution, right? It passed by the slimmest of margins. And a lot of the pushback was about wanting to preserve Oregon's history, right? The idea of what, many of us heard that as wanting to preserve this conception of a racist white utopia, right? Oregon becomes a useful case study because the only thing unique about Oregon is that Oregon was bold enough to write it down, right? But the same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon shaped every state in the nation and shaped the nation as a whole. Because the foundation of America is as a racist white utopia, right? And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to hold on to that, right? That the institutions that shape our lives were being conceptualized and created at times when the idea here in Oregon and nationally was about this is a place for white folks, right? Because if you go back and read the original language of the European colonizers who first came here, right, they talk about manifest destiny. They say that God gave this land to white folks because indigenous people were not using it properly, and that white folks had the right to do whatever was necessary, including genocide, including theft of land, including chattel slavery, to make it productive, right? That's their language, not mine, right? They included some weird spelling in these and thous, but other than that, that's exactly what they said, right? So I think it's incredibly important that Oregon becomes a useful case study because it was bold enough to write it down and reinforce it. But this is a national conversation, a national problem dealing around racism. And many folks say to me when I say this, well, yes, it's unfortunate that Oregon was founded as a white homeland. Maybe it was founded as a white homeland. But that was a long time ago, right? That has actually nothing to do with today. It has nothing to do with why we're here talking about equity at work. Do we believe that? I hope we don't believe that, right? I think that, again, this city, this state, this nation is a culmination of its history, right? And so the very idea of Portland, that Portland, has exported and has sort of had forced on it, this concept of Portlandia, right? We all know. This conception of Portland is really what Portlandia is a white liberal playground, right? A place where you can come, pretend like it's the 90s again, be a unicorn, work part-time at a coffee shop, that's the idea, right? And the idea behind Portland's progressiveness and its liberalness is inextricably tied to its treatment of people of color, right? That Portland is able to have these excess resources and to be able to envision itself in this, this place where it's, a pinnacle of urban planning in a national landscape where, it's got bike lanes and trees and all of these pieces, is predicated on the idea that those resources were kept only for white folks, right? That they were not distributed amongst everyone here. So they were hoarded, right? So this concept of Portland as a liberal bastion is directly founded on people of color's exclusion, exploitation, and containment here in Oregon, and in Portland, right? And we can't forget that, even as I love trees, y'all, and I like a bike lane as much as the next person, but we can't forget that is the foundation of what's going on. And we can see that today, right? We can see that operating today with the most recent report that came out, the State of Housing Report by the Portland Housing Bureau in 2015, that found that if you are Black, if you are Indigenous, if you are Latino, you cannot afford to live in Portland, right? Those red no's all the way across, right? You cannot afford to be here. And so, in essence, in the structural ways that matter, Portland continues to be a white homeland, right? Because the methods may have changed, but the result remains the same. People of color cannot be in Portland. And there is a problem with that. And I believe that if we are going to, call ourselves liberal and progressive, we can't hold both of those at the same time, right? And also, if we look at employment, we see the same legacy, right? So we see that the unemployment rates in Oregon are higher than the rest of the nation, but we see that the unemployment rates for people of color are incredibly higher here as well as nationally. The Black unemployment rate nationally as well as here in Oregon has always been around double the standard unemployment rate. And so, talking about work, right, this is vitally important because this is not a new conversation. This is not something that happened with an economic downturn, right? This is something that has been fundamental and has been ongoing statistically for decades. And so, again, if we're going to talk about justice, we have to dig deep down into that, right? Because this history and this reality of employment and work and who gets access to work and how it is incredibly racialized, again, is not a new one. And so we can see in 1862 that Oregon actually implemented a law that instituted a tax. So if you were Black, Chinese, or Hawaiian, you had to pay an annual tax just to be in Oregon, right? So if you wanted to stay in Oregon, you had to pay to stay here. If you could not afford to pay, then you would be pressed into service, basically utilized as slave labor by the state to pay off your debt, right? This law actually is a precursor to the laws that we see sweep the nation after the end of legal slavery, right? After 1865, we see the Black codes arise, especially in the southern states. These are laws that criminalize behavior only for Black folks, and they're focused on re-enslaving Black people through the use of the criminal legal system, right? This is part and parcel of the ways that work is racialized, right? That was work that was being forced upon folks outside of the context of slavery, but directly connected to the context of slavery. The reality of this is true for other communities of color. So we see in 1882, we see that the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, right? So we know the narrative, hopefully we know the narrative, that Asian labor and especially Chinese folks were incredibly essential in building the transcontinental railroad that it is really the backbone of this country's economic structure, right? And that it was incredibly dangerous, brutal, hazardous work, and that folks were treated horribly. But they were purposely recruited to come and do this work until their labor was no longer needed, right? When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in the 1860s, 1870s, we begin to see things like this, like the Federal Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882 that banned Chinese folks from becoming citizens, right? So again, this is about exploitation of labor and the ways that it is racialized and the ways that that has been institutionalized. So in 1923, the Alien Land Bill was passed. And so the Alien Land Bill made it illegal for immigrants who are not citizens to own or lease land in Oregon. But this was coupled with a law passed federally that basically said immigrants of color could not become citizens, right? So what this law in Oregon did was focused on taking away the businesses and the work that were happening in immigrant communities of color, particularly a thriving Chinatown and Japantown at that time. So again, this is a different kind of work, moving into saying, all right, we're not doing this labor, then we're engaging in creating businesses to serve our communities, and this was instituted to attack that. We can move forward and see that continuing in 1942, during World War II with the Bracero Project, and the ways that folks were recruited and then their labor was incredibly exploited, that they worked under brutal, hazardous conditions as well, that they were forced to work 7 days a week or face deportation. And also, I think what's important is that camps across this country, and especially in the Northwest, had strikes, had disruptions, had protests, had uprisings against this, that folks organized themselves against these conditions, even under dangerous and hazardous realities that they were living. Great. And lastly, the 1950s, want to talk about indigenous communities and land, right? And that in the 1950s, the United States terminated treaty rights with indigenous communities, right? Basically said, we no longer recognize you as a sovereign nation, and these millions of acres of land you have, we consider them to be up for grabs, right? That's as if we went to Canada and said, we no longer recognize you as a country, and as far as we know, all of this is ours, and we can take it, right? These were separate sovereign nations. And so it hit Oregon extremely hard, right? And I think that this piece is incredibly important because we can't look at the concept of work and employment in isolation from these other issues that shape all of our lives. I think that we often try and divide things up into these neat boxes, right? Housing, employment, criminal legal system, and that's not the way that systems function, and that's not the way that people experience their lives, right? That these are all intertwined. And taking away millions of acres of land certainly affected the economic stability of those communities immensely, right? And the ability to work and to take care of communities. So I think that, moving into the final piece, and especially for folks here who are working in the public sector, who are working with governments, it's important to see that government has used laws and policies again and again and again to reinforce injustice, right? And the concept of what we're talking about, to reinforce white supremacy. And so when we talk about what is it going to take to create justice, or in this context, what's it going to take to create racial justice, we have to recognize it can't be a one-off, right? It's not something on a checklist. Racial justice, check. What am I having for lunch, right? That as I said at the beginning, these institutions have been built and constructed for hundreds of years, right? And reinforced continually. So justice must also be built and constructed and reinforced continually. And that's going to take a lot of hard work and dedication and courage to do that, right? And it has to be reaffirmed at every level. So if we take the racial exclusionary clause in the Constitution, in Oregon's Constitution, which again was not removed until 2001, so for about 100 years, the Black community came forward to the legislature, to the Oregon people, tried a multiplicity of tactics to say, please remove this language. And again and again and again, that language was reinforced. It's fine, we're gonna leave it, right? So we can't just one time have one event that takes it out and say, our bad, right? And now we'll go, now we're done, we're good, right? We must reinforce and reaffirm justice over and over and over again continually, right? And I think that in this affirmation of justice, one of the key pieces is taking the leadership and agency of those folks who are directly affected, right? That those folks who are directly affected, marginalized people, in this context, folks of color, they don't need folks to come in and tell them what to do to create justice in their communities. That they have been organizing and working and holding justice for hundreds of years. And what they need are allies, right? They need allies of justice, allies for justice, that are able to provide support, access, resources, but still maintain the centrality of the leadership of the folks who are marginalized. So I don't think that I can say that enough, right? Marginalized people don't need saviors, they need allies. Right? Because marginalized communities have never been passive victims. They've always been active change makers, right? That again and again and again, folks have organized to address their own needs. And when they do so, I think what's incredibly important is that oppressed communities make institutions that make all of our lives better, safer, and more whole. I think that we're so often operating on the scarcity model, right? Well, if someone else gets more, that means I get less, right? If this community gets more, they're just going to keep asking, and then they're going to ask, and they're going to ask. We don't have enough to keep doling it out to everyone. But that's not actually the way that justice works, right? Justice starts multiplying itself. It starts growing offshoots. You're like, oh, wait, I started out with a little bit of justice. Now I got a lot of justice. That's awesome, right? So, when communities that are oppressed build institutions, they build institutions that center those folks who have been most marginalized, which addresses the needs of larger communities as well. And I just want to pull out 2 quick examples in the interest of time. So in 1867, the Salem school district refused to allow black children to go to school, and there was no school for them. So the black community engaged in a 2-prong approach. One, they raised $427.50. You give them that 50 cents, y'all. That was a lot of money in 1867, right? To start a school. And they started a school to address their children's own needs, while they also engaged in a lawsuit to force the school district to take over maintenance of that school. And they won, right? So through their 2-pronged organizing approach, they actually created institutions that made public education more accessible to everyone. The second example is the Black Panther Party. So the Black Panther Party is a national organization. I teach a class on it. I will not go off on a tangent. I'm going to stay focused. Yes, I know, I got Emmett. You're on it. I got this. So the Black Panther Party in 1969 started healthcare clinics in Portland. So they had 2 healthcare clinics. They also ran free breakfast programs for children, right? So the 2 healthcare clinics they had, all of their programs were open to anyone. Anyone who walked in, if you were hungry, if you needed healthcare, there was no question around race, no question around insurance or money. The only question they asked at the healthcare clinics were, what's wrong with you and how can we help make you better, right? The dental clinic that the Panthers ran for free was taken over eventually by OHSU, Oregon Health Sciences University, and it's still operating today as a low-income dental clinic, right? I think that is a perfect example that shows us that when marginalized folks create institutions and community-based resources to address the needs not being met by the larger society, it makes all of our communities better. Because of the organizing work of the Black Panther Party, that community has had access to free dental care under the Panthers and low-income dental care under OHSU for almost 50 years, for almost half a century, right? Yeah. So, again, I think that when we center those folks who have been marginalized, right, and support the leadership of those folks, all of us benefit. And I think my last point is going to be a super, super nerdy science fiction point. So bear with me. Apologies if you're not into that. I think that when we're thinking about institutional change, we have to be utterly unrealistic, right? I think that oftentimes we're told you have to start with what's realistic, what's a possible change, what is a winnable goal, right? I think that's actually an absolute fallacy that keeps us from actually making deep, institutional, meaningful change. Because when you look at the history, all change that has been deep and transformative was thought to be impossible at the time that it happened, right? If we just take the institution of slavery in this country, Black folks were told again and again and again that slavery would never end, that it would continue forever in this country, right? An enslaved Black person in this country in 1850 had no reason to think that slavery would ever end. In fact, they had every reason to think this would continue forever and that all of their children to come would be enslaved, right? They were told the best they could hope for was reform, was a kinder, gentler slavery, right? That's the best that they could hope for. And enslaved Black folks rejected that, absolutely. And they said, we will dream of freedom, and if you're telling us it's impossible, then we will change the entire world until it is possible and until it's reality. And that's exactly what they did, right? So I think that this is why I do work with science fiction, because I think it's the genre that allows us to throw out everything we're told is real and start with saying, what do we actually want, right? What do we want to imagine? Where do we want our minds to go? What does justice look like to us, right? And so I think that starting with that question, starting with that science fiction question, what is the world we want to live in, And what is my role in shaping that? Rather than starting with the question, what is a winnable goal, right? What is a realistic win? I think that when we start with that, and we start with being utterly unrealistic, in that way, we can be people who birth real justice into being. So I appreciate y'all so much for listening to me. I just wanted to share with you, if you want access to the timeline, you can see the full timeline on a YouTube video, Oregon Black History Timeline, so you can see the slides I shared as well as more. So thank you so much, and thanks again to the organizing committee for having me. Thank you all.
Oh, come on, you can do better than that. That's hard work. Before you folks start to depart, there's some things we need to share with you. If you just indulge us just for a few moments. Walidah Imarisha is really one of our young and emerging scholars. She does scholarly work, and it's always good to have folks come and bring you the academic stuff that's involved in society and what makes our world go round. I'd just like to follow up, if I could, and say that we who are public sector workers are really the champions that are going to change our community, our state, our country, and influence the world. Don't forget what she mentioned, marginalized people, disenfranchised people. Not all marginalized people are black people. Marginalized people are white people. They're Latino, they're Asian. They come in all size, shapes, and colors. And what we want to do today is have you understand that you can be the difference maker. There are policymakers here. There are social workers here. There are law enforcement community that's here. It's you that's going to make the difference. Not one singular enigmatic figure who's going to stand and transform our nation. If we're going to make it another 200 years, we need to understand that equity begins at work. Equity begins at work. And when we build inclusion at work, then we fully understand that governmental things and societal things that she has talked about that has so divided us and separated us, they come down. Because we're the ones that go into homes and communities. We go into burning buildings. We go into impoverished communities. We go into the upper echelons of business. And we're the ones that can demand equity, diversity, and inclusion. Thank you, Walidah, very much.